Maybe we should stop wasting time asking, Mom, Rebecca said with a tired sigh. She can barely keep up with her own bills. The room fell quiet for a moment, and then a few people nodded. No one looked at me. No one seemed concerned about whether those words were true. They simply accepted them because they fit the version of me they had created in their minds. I sat at the far end of my son's dining table, my hands folded neatly in my lap, and listened as my family discussed a financial crisis that threatened to tear apart everything they had built. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and let me know where you're watching from, because what happened next taught me a lesson about family, respect, and assumptions that I never expected to learn at 68 years old. The emergency meeting had been called on a rainy Thursday evening. Daniel insisted it was urgent. His voice on the phone had sounded strained, almost desperate. When I arrived at his large suburban home outside Denver, every seat around the dining table was already occupied. Rebecca sat beside him with a stack of papers. My niece Karen was there. So was Daniel's younger cousin, Mark. Everyone wore the same expression, a mixture of worry and calculation. The smell of coffee filled the room. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, tension hung in the air so heavily it felt almost visible. Daniel cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. The company is in serious trouble, he said. If we don't find funding soon, we may have to shut down operations. A murmur spread around the table. Rebecca lowered her eyes dramatically. Karen reached for a tissue. Mark shook his head and muttered something under his breath. I remained silent. Daniel's construction management company had been successful for years. Hearing those words surprised me, but not nearly as much as what followed. For the next hour, everyone discussed loans, investors, and emergency financing. They talked over one another. They argued. They worried. Yet somehow nobody asked for my opinion. Nobody wondered whether I had experience or insight. I might as well have been a decorative lamp sitting in the corner. Then Rebecca spoke the sentence that changed everything. We need realistic solutions, she said. Mom isn't exactly in a position to help. She smiled politely when she said it, but the smile never reached her eyes. A few people chuckled softly. Daniel didn't correct her. He didn't defend me. He simply stared at the financial reports scattered across the table. I looked down at my teacup. The porcelain was warm against my fingertips. Years ago, that kind of comment would have hurt me. Years ago, I would have gone home and cried. But age has a way of teaching perspective. I had learned that people often reveal their true character when they think you have nothing to offer. The truth was almost funny. They thought I was struggling because I drove a 10-year-old sedan. They thought I was broke because I lived in the same modest house I had owned for decades. They thought I was barely surviving because I wore practical clothes and rarely talked about money. None of them knew that 10 years earlier, after my husband passed away, I had quietly invested a portion of my savings into something most people considered foolish at the time. None of them knew that investment had grown beyond anything I ever imagined. None of them knew that while they were debating how to save a company, I was sitting there with access to nearly $18 million in cryptocurrency. I listened as Rebecca suggested selling assets. I listened as Mark proposed bringing in outside partners. I listened as Daniel admitted the banks had already rejected their applications. And through it all, I said nothing. Because money was not the most important thing happening in that room. What mattered was seeing who they became when they believed I was powerless. And as the rain continued tapping against the windows, I began to realize this family crisis was about much more than finances. It was about truth. It was about respect. And before the night was over, I would learn exactly how little of either remained. That meeting stayed in my mind long after I drove home that night. Rain followed me almost the entire way, washing across the windshield in slow, steady waves while the headlights of passing cars blurred into streaks of white and gold. I kept hearing Rebecca's voice, not because it was cruel. In truth, she had said far worse things over the years. What lingered was how casually she had dismissed me, as if my life could be summarized by a quick assumption, as if I had become invisible. When I reached my house, I parked in the driveway and sat in silence for several minutes. The porch light illuminated the small front yard I had cared for myself for nearly 20 years. The white fence needed fresh paint. The flower beds were simple. Nothing about the property suggested wealth. That was exactly why I liked it. After Daniel's father passed away, people expected me to make dramatic changes. Friends suggested I sell the house. Others encouraged me to move into a luxury condominium downtown. Some thought I should travel constantly. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was. I kept the same routines. I drank coffee from the same mug every morning. I walked the same neighborhood streets. I found comfort in consistency. What nobody knew was that grief had changed the way I viewed money. During the first year after losing my husband, I spent countless evenings reading about markets, technology, and long-term investments. I was not looking for a miracle. I was looking for purpose. One afternoon, I came across an article discussing digital assets. Most people dismissed the idea as speculation. Many laughed at it, but something about it captured my attention. I studied for months before investing a modest amount. Then I waited. Years passed. The value climbed, then climbed again. Eventually, the numbers became so large that I stopped discussing them with anyone. Not because I wanted to hide wealth, because I wanted to protect my peace. The fewer people knew, the simpler life remained. Unfortunately, simplicity often looks like weakness to the wrong people. Over time, small changes began appearing in my relationship with Daniel and Rebecca. They rarely asked for advice anymore. Decisions happened without me. Family plans were made without consulting me. During holidays, I noticed I was often seated at the edge of conversations rather than included in them. None of these moments seemed significant on their own. Together, they formed a pattern. A quiet message repeated again and again. They respected success they could see. Expensive homes impressed them. Luxury vehicles impressed them. Business achievements impressed them. A retired widow living in a modest neighborhood did not. The following morning, I woke before sunrise and prepared breakfast. The house was still. The kitchen clock ticked softly above the stove. I carried my coffee to the dining table and opened my laptop. Overnight messages filled my inbox. One message stood out immediately. It was from Martin Caldwell, the financial advisor who had helped oversee part of my portfolio for years. The subject line was simple: "Call me when you have a moment." I stared at the screen for a second. Martin rarely sent messages without a reason. I took a sip of coffee and looked out the window at the quiet street beyond my yard. Something told me the family crisis was larger than Daniel had admitted. And deep down, I suspected I was about to learn a truth that would change everything I thought I knew about my son's situation. I called Martin later that morning. His voice was calm, but there was a seriousness beneath it that immediately caught my attention. We exchanged a few pleasantries before he moved directly to the reason for his message. "Eleanor, I have been reviewing some public records and business filings connected to Daniel's company," he said. "There are details you should probably know." I sat down at the kitchen table and listened carefully. For the next 20 minutes, Martin explained a series of decisions that painted a very different picture from the one presented during the family meeting. The company had not suddenly stumbled into trouble. The warning signs had existed for years. Large loans had been taken out during profitable periods. Expensive expansions had been approved without adequate reserves. Several luxury purchases had been made through related business accounts. None of it was illegal. None of it was hidden. But together it revealed a pattern of spending that made my stomach tighten. When the call ended, I remained seated for a long time. Sunlight had begun to fill the kitchen. The coffee in my mug had gone cold. I found myself thinking back over the last several years, replaying moments that had once seemed insignificant. I remembered Rebecca arriving at Thanksgiving in a new luxury sport utility vehicle and laughing when someone asked about the price. I remembered Daniel discussing a vacation home they were considering near the mountains. I remembered the expensive renovations, the designer furniture, the private school tuition, and the endless upgrades that always seemed to appear whenever I visited. At the time, I assumed they could afford it. Daniel's company appeared successful. Why would I question it? Yet now those memories felt different, like puzzle pieces quietly sliding into place. The more I thought about it, the more another realization emerged. During those same years, their attitude toward me had gradually changed. Not overnight. Slowly, almost invisibly, the comments became more frequent. The assumptions became more obvious. Whenever financial topics came up, Rebecca spoke to me as though I were unfamiliar with basic concepts. Daniel often corrected me before I had even finished speaking. If I offered an opinion, it was politely acknowledged and quickly ignored. I never argued. I never demanded attention. I simply noticed. One memory surfaced more clearly than the others. 2 years earlier, during Olivia's birthday dinner, someone asked how retirement was treating me. Before I could answer, Rebecca smiled and said, "Mom keeps things simple. She does not have expensive tastes." Everyone laughed lightly. The conversation moved on. At the time, I smiled too. But now I realized nobody had ever asked what I actually enjoyed, what I had accomplished, or what I was capable of. They had already decided who I was. A quiet widow, a modest retiree, a woman living on limited means. That version of me made them comfortable. It allowed them to feel successful by comparison. The following afternoon, my phone rang again. This time it was Daniel. His voice sounded exhausted. He asked if we could meet for dinner later that week. "There are some things we need to discuss as a family," he said. I agreed. Immediately, after we ended the call, I looked out the window at the peaceful street beyond my front yard. Something told me that dinner would not be about family at all. It would be about money. And for the first time, I began wondering how differently they would treat me if they knew the truth. The dinner took place 3 nights later at Daniel and Rebecca's house. The rain had finally passed, leaving behind a cool autumn evening and clear skies. When I arrived, the atmosphere felt strangely rehearsed. Everyone seemed determined to appear relaxed. Yet beneath the smiles, I sensed the same tension that had filled the emergency meeting. Rebecca greeted me warmly at the door, warmer than usual. Daniel offered to take my coat before I could even ask where to hang it. Small gestures, ordinary gestures. Yet after years of polite distance, they felt unusual enough to notice. The dining table was set beautifully. Candles flickered softly. Fresh flowers sat in the center. Olivia smiled when she saw me and wrapped her arms around my shoulders. Her affection was genuine, one of the few things in the family I never questioned. Throughout dinner, the conversation stayed comfortably away from business. We discussed school, neighborhood events, weather forecasts, and holiday plans. Rebecca laughed more than usual. Daniel asked questions about my garden. For a brief moment, I almost convinced myself that I had imagined the growing distance between us. Then dessert arrived. The shift happened so smoothly that it might have gone unnoticed by someone less attentive. Daniel placed his fork down and exchanged a glance with Rebecca. She nodded slightly. I watched the silent communication pass between them. Then Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom," he began carefully, "you know things have been difficult lately." There it was, the real reason for the invitation. I set my coffee cup down and waited. He explained that the company was facing immediate pressure. Several obligations were approaching. Investors remained hesitant. Banks were unwilling to extend additional credit. His words sounded practiced, polished by repetition. Rebecca joined in, emphasizing how stressful the situation had become for everyone involved. I listened quietly. Then came the request. Not directly, not at first. Instead, they spoke about sacrifice, about family helping family, about everyone contributing what they could during hard times. Rebecca mentioned relatives who had already offered assistance. Daniel described friends who were exploring options. Eventually, the conversation reached its destination. "We were wondering if you might be willing to help a little," Rebecca said gently. "Nothing major, just enough to give us some breathing room." The phrase almost made me smile. Help a little, as though they were discussing a modest grocery bill rather than a financial crisis, as though they already knew the limits of what I could provide. Daniel quickly added that they understood my situation and did not want to place pressure on me. Yet the assumption remained clear. They believed my resources were small. They believed any contribution would require sacrifice. What struck me most was not the request itself. Families help one another. There is nothing wrong with that. What stayed with me was how confidently they had decided who I was without ever asking. The conversation continued for another hour. Numbers were discussed. Possibilities were explored. Through it all, I remained calm and offered few opinions. By the time I drove home that night, one truth had become impossible to ignore. They were not asking me because they valued my judgment. They were asking because every other door had started to close. And somewhere deep inside, I knew an even bigger revelation was approaching. Over the next week, the requests became more frequent. They were never direct demands. They arrived wrapped in concern, courtesy, and carefully chosen words. Daniel called twice to provide updates on the company. Rebecca sent messages asking how I was doing. One afternoon, she even dropped off a homemade pie at my front door. Anyone watching from the outside might have thought our family was growing closer. Yet every conversation seemed to circle back to the same destination: funding, investors, loans, cash flow. It was as though the crisis had become the center of their universe. Meanwhile, Martin continued gathering information. During one of our meetings, he showed me several public filings and financial summaries that confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. The situation was worse than Daniel admitted. but not because of bad luck. Years of aggressive spending had left very little margin for error. Profitable years had been treated like permanent guarantees. Expensive risks had been taken because success appeared endless. Now reality had arrived. I felt sympathy for my son. I truly did. Nobody enjoys watching their child struggle, regardless of age. But sympathy and trust are not the same thing. The more I learned, the more cautious I became. One Saturday afternoon, I attended Olivia's school music recital. She played beautifully. Watching her perform reminded me why I had stayed patient through everything. She was kind, thoughtful, and untouched by the habits that had shaped the adults around her. After the performance, families gathered outside the auditorium. Parents took photographs. Grandparents congratulated their grandchildren. As we stood together near the parking lot, I overheard a conversation I do not think Rebecca intended me to hear. She was speaking with another parent a few yards away. "We are carrying so much responsibility right now," she said. "Sometimes it feels like nobody can really help us." Then the other woman asked whether family had offered support. Rebecca laughed softly. "Not really. Daniel's mother lives on a fixed retirement income. There is only so much she can do." The words were not cruel. In some ways, they were worse than cruel. They were dismissive, final, certain. Once again, my entire life had been reduced to an assumption. I stood there smiling politely while Olivia spoke excitedly about her music teacher. Rebecca never realized I had hurt her. That evening, I returned home and sat on my back porch as the sun disappeared beyond the rooftops. The air carried the first hint of winter. I thought about all the years I had spent building stability, making careful decisions, and planning for the future. Nobody had witnessed those quiet sacrifices. Nobody had asked about them. They simply saw an older woman, living modestly, and assumed the story ended there. My phone vibrated just as darkness settled across the neighborhood. A message from Daniel appeared on the screen. He wanted to organize another family dinner the following week. According to him, there were important developments and everyone needed to be present. I stared at the message for several seconds before replying that I would attend. Something told me this gathering would be different from the others. The pressure around them was growing. Options were disappearing. And for the first time, I sensed they were preparing to ask for far more than a little help. The final family dinner arrived on a cold evening that felt heavier than the last. A thin layer of frost had formed along the edges of the sidewalks as I drove toward Daniel and Rebecca's house. The neighborhood lights glowed softly behind bare trees, creating a calm surface that did not match the tension I expected inside that home. When I stepped through the front door, I immediately felt the difference in atmosphere. There was no casual warmth this time, no light conversation. Everything felt carefully arranged, like a meeting rather than a family gathering. Daniel stood near the living room, his posture tense. Rebecca was in the kitchen, moving dishes that did not need rearranging. Olivia greeted me with her usual kindness, but even she seemed quieter than before, as if she sensed the seriousness of the evening. We all eventually moved toward the dining table. It was set with precision, but no one touched their food immediately. Daniel began speaking after a long pause. His voice was steady, but there was an edge of exhaustion behind it. He explained that the situation had reached a critical point. Several financial commitments were coming due. A major investor had withdrawn support. 2 potential agreements had collapsed within days of each other. He did not need to say the word bankruptcy, but it hung in the air between every sentence. Rebecca took over the conversation. She spoke about responsibility, about how difficult it had been to manage everything, about how they had done everything possible to keep the company stable. Her tone shifted, between controlled frustration and carefully placed hope. Then the conversation turned in my direction again. This time there was less hesitation, less softness. Daniel looked directly at me. "Mom," he said, "we are at a point where we need real support. Not just advice, not just encouragement. We need something that can actually keep us afloat." Rebecca followed immediately. "We have explored every other option," she added. "At this stage, even a significant contribution could stabilize everything." The silence that followed felt different from the previous dinners. It was not polite silence. It was expectation. I could feel it pressing against me from both sides of the table. For a moment, I studied their faces. Daniel looked tired, but determined. Rebecca looked controlled, but insistent. Neither of them looked uncertain about asking me. That was what struck me most. They were no longer testing whether I might help. They had already decided I would try. I set my hands on the table gently. The wood was smooth and cool beneath my fingers. I listened to the details they continued to provide. Numbers, deadlines, consequences. Each sentence built toward the same conclusion. They needed financial rescue, and I was the final person they had chosen to ask. At one point, Rebecca leaned forward slightly. Her voice softened. "We know you have always been careful with your money," she said. "That is exactly why we thought you might understand how important this is." It was a clever sentence. Careful, respectful on the surface, but underneath, it still carried the assumption that I was limited, that whatever I had would be small, cautious, and manageable. I noticed Olivia watching quietly from the side of the table. She was the only one not speaking, the only one not trying to shape the outcome. I thought about the messages, the conversations, the subtle dismissals I had experienced over the past months. I thought about how easily they had defined my life without ever asking for clarity. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. Not anger, not sadness, clarity. I realized this dinner was not just about saving a business. It was about the story they had built around me, a story that had become so comfortable for them that they no longer questioned it. Daniel cleared his throat again, preparing to continue. But I already knew the decision I would make would not fit the version of me they had been relying on. The room felt heavier after Daniel finished speaking, as if every word had added another layer of pressure onto the air between us. Rebecca immediately followed his explanation with another attempt to reinforce urgency, describing timelines that felt sharper, tighter, and more unavoidable with each sentence. Yet I remained still, watching them both carefully, noticing not only what they were saying but how they were saying it. There was a practiced rhythm to their urgency now, as if they had rehearsed this conversation in private more than once before I arrived. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "We are not asking for everything," he said. "Just enough to stabilize the situation so we can restructure properly." Rebecca nodded quickly, adding that they had already reduced expenses, negotiated with partners, and explored every possible financial adjustment. The language was precise, but the conclusion they wanted was simple. They needed money, and they believed I was the last available source. I looked down at my plate for a moment, untouched since the beginning of the conversation. The food had long since lost its appeal. Instead, my attention shifted inward, toward the quiet awareness that had been building inside me for weeks. Every subtle dismissal, every assumption, every small moment of being overlooked had been leading to this point. Daniel's voice broke through my thoughts again. "Mom, we would not be asking if there was any other way." His tone softened slightly, as if trying to appeal to emotion rather than logic. Rebecca reached out and placed her hand lightly on his arm, reinforcing the sentiment. "We are family," she said gently. "We are supposed to support each other in times like this." The words hung in the air longer than the others. Family. It was a word that had been used often throughout my life, but tonight it carried a different weight. I slowly lifted my eyes and looked at each of them. Daniel, my son, who once used to ask me for advice about everything from school decisions to career choices. Rebecca, who had once been polite and uncertain in my presence, but now spoke with confidence that bordered on certainty. And Olivia, who sat quietly at the end of the table, observing everything without judgment. I realized that none of them were truly seeing me. They were seeing a role they had assigned to me long ago. A retired woman, a limited income, a background figure in their financial story. The more they spoke, the more clearly I understood that they were not just asking for help. They were expecting it in a specific amount, within a specific limit, shaped entirely by their assumptions. Rebecca leaned forward again, her voice slightly more insistent. "Even a partial contribution from you would make a significant difference," she said. "We have already calculated what we think is realistic based on your situation." There it was again, their version of my situation. Not once had they asked directly. Not once had they considered that their understanding might be incomplete. I felt no anger in that moment, only a quiet sense of recognition. The kind that comes when something hidden is finally fully visible. Daniel cleared his throat, preparing to continue, but I raised my hand slightly. The motion was small, almost gentle, but it stopped him immediately. The room fell into a deeper silence. Even Rebecca paused mid-breath. For the first time that evening, I had their complete attention, not because they were asking, but because I was finally no longer simply listening. The moment my hand rose slightly above the table, the entire room changed. Daniel stopped speaking immediately. Rebecca's expression froze mid-breath, and even the soft background sounds of the house seemed to fade into silence. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not forceful. It was simply final in a way they were not prepared for. I lowered my hand slowly and kept my gaze steady on all three of them. For a brief moment, I allowed the silence to settle completely, not as punishment, but as clarity. Then I spoke. My voice was calm, measured, and far more steady than I expected it to be. Before we continue this conversation, I said, I think there is something you all need to understand. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. Rebecca glanced at him, then back at me. Olivia remained still, watching quietly. I continued, you have all spoken tonight as if you already know my situation. As if you understand what I have, what I do not have, and what I am capable of doing. I paused, letting the words settle. But none of you have actually asked me. A faint discomfort spread across the table. Not anger, not defensiveness yet. Just the realization that the structure of the conversation had changed. Rebecca opened her mouth slightly, as if preparing to respond, but closed it again without speaking. Daniel leaned back slowly, his expression uncertain for the first time that evening. I took a small breath and continued. You believe I live on a fixed retirement income. You believe I have limited resources. You believe that any help I could offer would be small. I looked at each of them in turn. Those beliefs are not based on anything I told you. The silence deepened again. This time, it felt different. Heavier. More concentrated. I reached down beside my chair and picked up the simple black folder I had brought with me. I placed it gently on the table in front of me. The sound of it touching the wood was soft, but it drew every eye immediately. Daniel stared at it. Rebecca's posture stiffened slightly. I did not open it yet. Instead, I continued speaking. I did not come here tonight to argue. I did not come here to defend myself. And I certainly did not come here to match assumptions with explanations. I allowed a brief pause. I came here because I needed to understand whether this family still sees me as a person or only as a possibility. Olivia looked down at her hands, quietly processing everything. Daniel finally spoke, his voice lower than before. Mom, we are just under a lot of pressure right now. I nodded slightly, acknowledging his words without accepting their implication. I understand pressure, I replied. But pressure does not justify assumptions. Rebecca shifted in her seat, her voice now more careful. We never meant to assume anything, she said quickly. We just thought. She stopped, realizing she did not have a safe ending to that sentence. I looked at her directly. You thought what? I asked gently. The question was not aggressive. It was simply unavoidable. The room fell into another silence. Daniel's eyes moved between me and the folder on the table. He seemed to sense that something important was about to change, though he did not yet understand what it was. I placed my hand on the folder, but still did not open it. Tonight, I said quietly, you are going to learn exactly what you did not ask about. And for the first time in that entire evening, I saw uncertainty replace assumption across every face at the table. I kept my hand resting on the black folder, watching the faces across the table shift in real time. The uncertainty I had just placed into the room was no longer subtle. It had fully taken hold. Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on the folder as if it contained something far heavier than paper. Rebecca sat very still, her earlier confidence replaced with hesitation she could no longer hide. Olivia looked between all of us quietly, sensing that something important was unfolding, even if she did not yet understand it. I finally opened the folder. Inside were printed statements, account summaries, and portfolio reports carefully organized in simple sections. I did not rush. I placed each page on the table one by one, allowing them to see before I spoke. Daniel leaned forward slightly as his eyes scanned the first page. His expression changed almost immediately, though he said nothing. Rebecca followed, her gaze moving quickly across numbers, dates, and asset listings that did not match anything they had expected. Then I spoke. My voice remained calm, steady, and without emotion meant to provoke. 10 years ago, I said, after your father passed away, I made decisions about my financial future that none of you were aware of. I paused briefly, letting the words settle. I did not talk about it because I did not feel the need to. Daniel looked up at me, confusion and disbelief beginning to surface. I continued, while you believed I was living on a fixed retirement income, I was building something quietly, consistently, and with patience. I turned one of the pages toward them. These are my digital asset holdings. The words landed differently than I expected. Rebecca's hand moved slightly toward the paper, then stopped. I watched her eyes narrow as she processed the information line by line. Daniel finally spoke, his voice strained. "Mom, what is this value?" I did not answer immediately. Instead, I allowed him to read further. Then I said it clearly. $18 million. The number did not create noise at first. It created silence. A deeper kind of silence than anything that had come before. Rebecca leaned back slowly in her chair, as if her body needed distance from what she had just heard. Daniel shook his head slightly, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed. "That is not possible," he said quietly, more to himself than to me. I looked at him with the same calm expression I had maintained all evening. "It is not only possible," I replied. "It is real." I placed another document on the table, this one showing long-term transactions and early investments. "You believed I had nothing because I chose not to display anything," I said. "That is not the same thing." Rebecca finally spoke again, her voice softer now. "Why did you never tell us?" The question was not accusatory anymore. It was uncertain, almost fragile. I looked at her for a long moment before responding. "Because I wanted to know who would treat me the same way regardless." The words settled across the table with a weight that none of them could ignore. Daniel lowered his gaze. Rebecca said nothing further. Olivia reached quietly for my hand, the only gesture in the room that did not carry expectation or shock. I closed the folder gently and placed my hand on top of it. "Money does not create character," I said softly. "It reveals it." I stood slowly, and no one tried to stop me. For the first time that evening, there were no requests, no explanations, and no assumptions. Only silence, and the uncomfortable realization that everything they believed about me had been incomplete.